Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special first ever episode of Check the Manual, or rather Check the Magazine in this case. Today we have a very special episode, as today we are going to be taking a look at the very first ever issue of Sega Saturn Magazine, released in December of 1994, to coincide with the Sega Saturn's 30th anniversary. The console released on November 22nd, 1994, and so today we're going to be taking a look at some of the actual game coverage, articles, and advertisements in this very first issue. Now, starting things off, we actually have a advertisement, Saturn from Saturn. You'll see some cone heads pretty prominently featured in this advertisement. For whatever reason, Sega of Japan really liked using these cone heads like this dweeb is here as part of their early advertising. They even had some TV commercials featuring them pretty prominently. But you'll see they're all here playing Virtua Fighter along with some other games, some of the launch titles that were promoted in the bottom left. Right after the Coneheads, we have a lovely advertisement from Victor promoting their model of their Sega Saturn. Victor and Hitachi both had hardware that went into the Saturn, and so Sega gave them permission to actually produce their own versions of the hardware. It's no different than a normal Sega Saturn, aside from some BIOS changes, but I love that advertisement there. Now here we see an advertisement for Game Blast, another SoftBank magazine that the producers of Sega Saturn Magazine also made, centered around PC gaming at the time. You'll see some advertisements for SimCity, Return to Zork, Microsoft Flight Simulator. And then here on the next page we have contents for the magazine, as well as an advertisement for Myst, one of the launch titles for the Saturn. Lovely PC port, really showed off what the hardware could do at the time in 1994. And I absolutely love this page. Welcome to Sega Saturn World. Has some of the hardware specs and even more contents. Here we have a little bit more of an in-depth look at the specs for both the Sega Saturn and the Victor V Saturn. Both systems are identical aside from their BIOS. Both feature two Hitachi SH2 processors, as well as VDP 1 and 2, which stands for Video Display Processing 1 and 2, to process those 2D and 3D games for the Saturn. I also like how this page pretty prominently features the control panel in the lower right hand side. Early on, Sega really promoted this system not only as a game console, but also as a multimedia player for video CDs, CDs in general. So it's nice to see them promoting their control panel. That's one of the main things I love. Continuing on with the hardware look through, you'll see we're in the hard detail section of the magazine. It takes a look at all sides of the console, the controller, included cables, as well as the STV Titan arcade board in the bottom right. A lot of ports from that board actually came home to the Saturn. Some pretty prominent shooters like Cotton Boomerang, Golden Axe the Duel, stuff like that. Now, even at launch, Sega was very committed to bringing the arcade experience home. So you'll see a handful of peripherals that are already available at launch, things like the Virtua Stick for Virtua Fighter, the Saturn Shuttle Mouse, the steering wheel for games like Daytona USA and Gale Racer, as well as the 6-player multi-adapter. And then on the right-hand side, like I said, they're promoting the Saturn as a multi-CD player for things like photo CDs, CD-EGs, ebooks, and music CDs. Now, the one CD format that wasn't supported by Saturn natively were video CDs. Another peripheral that you could purchase at the time of launch was this video CD card featured in the top left that you could plug into the back expansion port for video CD playback on your console. Up next, we have a section detailing Virtua Fighter, the killer app for the Saturn at launch. This next section of the magazine is entirely dedicated to Virtua Fighter. This was the killer app at launch for the console. Every system needed one. The SNES had Mario World, N64 had Mario 64, Switch had Breath of the Wild. For the Saturn, it was Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter was going through a big craze in Japan. It was easily one of the most popular arcade games of '93 and carried that momentum into '94. And so the first issue of Sega Saturn Magazine here dedicates a full 39-page spread going over all about Virtua Fighter, basic techniques. You'll see here on this page stuff about blocking, counterattacks, even more information into throwing. And like I said, a 39-page spread just for one game in the magazine. That's how important this was for the Saturn at launch. Here we have the first of many character profiles for the game, starting off with Jackie Bryant. You'll see here in pretty close detail actual combos that you could practice on the home console version of Virtua Fighter. Outside of those basic combos you can practice, you also get a full move list. Some of these moves are in the manual as well, but it's nice to have a more in-depth move list here. I don't believe all of them are listed in that manual, so it's nice to see that here. Up next, we have the character profile for Jeffrey McWild, my preferred character when playing Virtua Fighter. You'll see each character has a 2P color as well for the second player. I win! I love that win quote from Jeffrey there. He's one of my, like I said, favorite characters, the grappler of the game, a lot of fun. Sarah, the sister of Jackie, is up next. Again, very similar stuff you'll get to see in the move list. And then from here, we'll actually skip ahead quite a few pages. So outside of the character profiles, you'll actually see more information on the arcade mode. If you don't have a friend to play with, this is going to be the preferred mode of play for a lot of Saturn buyers. Lastly, but certainly not least in terms of this coverage for Virtua Fighter, I do have a little interview with some of the musicians that actually composed a arranged version of the soundtrack to bring home for the Saturn port, taking advantage of some of that CD audio compared to the arcade version of the game. So you get some more information on how they try to capture that. Immediately following the coverage of Virtua Fighter, you actually have a staff interview with some of the head leaders of building the Saturn, as well as Yu Suzuki, a pretty prominent arcade developer. If you want to check more of that information out, you could click the link below to read the blog article I posted to kind of coincide this video, so you could actually get to read a little bit more about their thoughts on the system, marketing, developing the new technology of CD-ROMs, and kind of what that looks like for the Saturn. Now obviously at launch, Virtua Fighter wasn't the only game. You also had another handful of titles that released in November and December of '94, so we're going to take a look at some of those in this issue as well. Starting off with Myst, a pretty seminal PC classic at this point, one of the best-selling PC games at the time, taking advantage of pre-rendered cutscenes, and it was also, one of the first times that it came home to a home console pretty accurately, so definitely a big win for the Saturn and showing what the console could actually do. And what would a Japanese console launch be without the Mahjong game? I'm not too sure too much about this Mahjong game in particular. I just know you're playing against those 4 characters in the bottom left, and I like how they actually write up some of the coverage for this game. Those characters are talking back and forth about the Saturn launch games, which ones they like more, Daytona USA or Panzer Dragoon, and they say, well, what about our game, you idiot? It's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that one. Up next is one of the main reasons why I love the Saturn. It's just odd software in games like this, such as Tama. I think it's also translated to like the giddy adventures of the ball Tama. You'll see you're actually rolling a ball around in a 3-dimensional maze, trying to get it out. It's not one of the greatest titles, honestly. It didn't review very well in the magazine in the coming months and scored pretty low. But an interesting game nonetheless. Kind of a weird title though. Another genre represented early on in the Saturn's lifetime was the kind of visual novel adventure detective game with Wayne Chai Connection. Here you actually play as a Hong Kong police officer trying to solve a murder mystery. Other than that, I don't know too much about the game, just mainly because the fact that it is majority in Japanese, but I would love to play it someday if it ever got translated. Up next, we have one of the first ever games not part of the initial launch. This came out on December 2nd. This game is The Mansion of Hidden Souls. Very important to make that distinction, as just Mansion of Hidden Souls was already on Sega CD. In this game you play as a human turned into a little butterfly, and you are trapped inside this mansion, fully composed of full motion video, and you are trying to go around the mansion trying to solve the mystery of why you turned into a butterfly, and talking with some of the other residents in the mansion along the way. The Sega CD version, or Mega CD version, I think had a pretty creepy atmosphere about it. Creepy for 1993, but here some of these CG faces kind of take away from, I guess, the aura of it all, but another interesting title. Up next, we have another Sega-developed game, Clockwork Knight. This would be how you would get your platformer fix early on into the Saturn's lifespan. It also used some pre-rendered characters, similar to like a Donkey Kong Country on the SNES. So I guess for some people it was used as maybe a graphical showpiece. Overall, the game's pretty short. You could beat it in an evening. It's still a good amount of fun. And they also made a sequel for it as well, so if you like what you saw, or played rather, you could actually play that on the same system. And even in Japan, they created a combination pack of 1 and 2, which I think is pretty neat. Now, lastly, of the early 94 games that were released, you have Gale Racer, also known as Radmobile in the arcades. This was how you'd get your racing fix early on. Thankfully, there were some better racing games to come shortly after. This wasn't the best port, if I'm being completely honest. In the arcade, it was completely sprite scaling, but they actually moved some of the car models to 3D. You can see how the road kind of shifts and sways. But not a great port. Still a good amount of fun if you like racing games, but nothing spectacular. Kind of ending off the magazine in this last section is the new release section. So these are games to look out for on the horizon, starting off with Daytona USA. You can see currently it's at 20% completion, so still very early in the development cycle. That'll be shown on all things, and you can see that in some of the screenshots here compared to the arcade mode. They don't have any backgrounds for the races, or the character select screen looks very bare bones at this time, but still a good sign of what to come. And for all the games that you'll see covered in this new release schedule, they'll all have a percentage next to them. So for example, I think this is Worldwide Soccer as it released in the States. This is 80% complete, but then Time Warner's Virtual Racing, only 5% complete. I really like this setup for this magazine, especially since they're so close to so many developers in Japan. They can keep in week by week and actually see how far they are in progress with each game. Up next is one of my favorites for the system, Panzer Dragoon, one of the early 3D showpieces for the system, really taking advantage of that VDP-1 and VDP-2 processing chips. The gameplay is similar to like a Star Fox or even Star Fox 64, but the key difference is that you could actually kind of pivot your view to the left of you, right of you, behind you, and so that way you can shoot enemies on all sides. Definitely, if you have never played a Saturn, Panzer Dragoon is one of the games you should absolutely play. Now here's some games that you actually probably shouldn't play for the Saturn. On the left hand side you have Race Driving. The game is kind of awful. Mystara, or as it's also known in Japan, Riglord Saga, also known as Blazing Heroes after a copyright dispute, isn't a bad game. A little strategy RPG by Microcabin. Not a bad game by any means, but not everyone's cup of tea. However, this is the real highlight here. Virtual Highlight. Look at those graphics. Nah, I can't dog on Virtual Highlight too much. It has a certain charm to it. The devs seemed like they really tried hard on something, maybe. But it's kind of the Wild West of early 3D and what works, what doesn't work, so I'll give them some slack there. Thankfully, we have some better games on this page. Not quite Daedalus here in the bottom right. That game's okay, but a little Doom clone. I personally like Wing Arms a little bit more, a nice kind of World War II flight sim from Sega. Also Magic Knight Ray Earth, a nice little action RPG. It actually was one of the last US titles ever to be released, funnily enough, even though the game got released in '95 in Japan. Continuing the theme of some better games here, you'll have some better looking racing games, stuff like Grand Chaser, I believe, in the bottom left. You have World Series Baseball, as it was brought over here in the States, not to be confused with World Series Baseball. Also on other systems, you got Rayman, released on the Jaguar, but also came to the Saturn and PlayStation as well as our man, Craig Stadler, and Pebble Beach Golf Links, spelled with an X. Don't know why it's spelled with an X, but kind of funny. Now, if this page isn't a good indicator on how crazy Japan was for Virtua Fighter, they're already asking about, will Virtua Fighter 2 be able to come to Saturn? Virtua Fighter 1 just came out for the dang thing, and they're already asking, is this arcade release, this, contemporary arcade release going to be able to come to Saturn? And then on this page, they kind of finalize the release schedule for some games, give some previews and month windows on games and when they're coming out. Like I said, Virtua Fighter 2 eventually does come out for the system later in '95, later become the kind of best-selling game for the system, I believe, both in Japan and the US. I'd have to double check that, but overall some fun stuff coming up on the horizon for Saturn in '95, which hopefully you'll see in some other videos. But one of the coolest things here on this page is a contest that you could have entered for Sega Saturn Magazine. And the coolest thing here is this freaking Daytona USA hat. If anyone has this and is watching this video, I want it. Can I buy it from you, like right now? I will send you money. I want this hat. Unfortunately, in our last page of coverage and advertisement of this magazine, we have the Super 32X. I say unfortunately just because it didn't perform very well in the States and was probably one of the main reasons for some consumer mistrust, not only in the States but also in Japan. This thing actually came out after the Saturn in Japan, which is crazy to me. Here you have an add-on for a console that didn't do well in its home country and came out after the brand new system. It'd be like, adding something on to your PS4 3 months after the PS5 just came out. Doesn't really make sense. There weren't a ton of games released for the thing, and actually I could probably make a whole video going over this thing, but that's for another day. And with that comes the end of our read through today of the first ever issue of the Japanese Sega Saturn Magazine. There was also a UK version of this magazine under the same name, so maybe for the 35th anniversary, we'll take a look at that together if I ever get that. But if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for celebrating the 30th anniversary of my favorite video game console with me together. I really do appreciate you sticking around. If you like this kind of content, consider leaving a like on the video, subscribing for more long-form, short-form content, not just of magazines but also game manuals, associated advertisements, disc art. I'm a big fan of game artwork and advertising in general, so this channel is going to be kind of a highlight of that kind of print media. So if you like this kind of content, like I said, consider leaving a like or subscribe, or even a comment of what you liked, what you disliked, as I continue to try to improve this kind of content. With all that being said, thank you so much for checking the magazine with me today, and you have a great rest of your day.